Okay, it is day 204 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 15 September 2022, approximately 2100 hours. The previous Sitrep was on day 167, 09 August. Now I'm going to get this out of the way right away here. This is going to be the final Sitrep. It is not even going to have all the information I normally put into them, because truthfully I see absolutely no reason to do a regular Sitrep on Ukraine. And the main reason for it is the war is not going to be allowed to end. Now, almost a month ago, not long after the last Sitrep video, it came out from people associated with the Ukrainian government that a peace deal had been reached between Russia and Ukraine back in early April. Under this peace deal, Russia was going to pull back to their pre-war positions on the border and inside the Donbass and in Crimea. As part of this agreement, Ukraine agreed they would not join NATO, but that they would be signing mutual defense treaties with different countries in Europe for in case Ukraine would ever be invaded. But they agreed, and they were going to state publicly that they would never try to join NATO. That was the main thing I kept hearing repeatedly since the war started, and even before the war started, that Russia was pushing for. This whole thing about Vladimir Putin trying to restore the Soviet Union and all that stuff, that was bullshit. That was a propaganda piece created by media people in the West to justify the war. Because if they told the truth, that Russia was doing this because of the Ukrainian government's mistreatment of ethnic Russians inside Ukraine, and that Ukraine and NATO were violating treaties they had signed with the former Soviet Union and the Russian Federation going back to 92, 94, they knew they wouldn't get people to support the war effort. So we were lied to on that. Now, this peace deal back in April. The Ukrainians supported it, the Russians supported it, and they were getting ready to announce it officially. Russia had pulled back from the northern and eastern outskirts of Kiev about 2 weeks prior. And then magically you had, or bravely, you had the former Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, arrived in Kiev. He was the first major European leader to arrive in the capital since the end of the siege. Reportedly, Boris Johnson pressured the Ukrainian government to continue the war, telling them that the United States and NATO would no longer support them, period, if they went through with the plea deal, or the peace deal. So immediately, the Ukrainian representatives at the peace conference notified Russia that there would be no deal. At that time is when Putin had done a press conference, which was probably not mentioned here in the West. This was around April 14th, I think was the date I had come across. And he stated that the tone had drastically shifted at the peace talks suddenly, and that there would be no peace deal. This was right after Boris Johnson went to Kiev. And then we started seeing even more higher end equipment flowing into Ukraine. After that is when we started seeing not just T-72s and old BMP-1s and BTRs from former Eastern Bloc countries going into Ukraine. We started seeing the announcements about the Panzerhaube 2000s. We started seeing about the announcements about the Leopard 2s going in. We started seeing announcements about German Gepard air defense tanks going in. We started seeing announcements on higher end anti-aircraft missiles from NATO, which a lot of those were still classified. People weren't even aware it had been adopted. Those were being sent into Ukraine. NATO, the European Union, the United States needs the war to continue in Ukraine into the foreseeable future. And the reasons I see for that is, one, to destroy the Russian military, to assist with the deliberate destruction of the economy, not just in Russia, but also here in the West. To bring the people here in the West, bring us down to the levels of neo-serfs, new serfs. Modern day slaves, updated. You'll have freedom, you just won't be on the plantation per se, but you'll essentially still be a slave working for a wage that doesn't matter how much you get paid. It will not cover anything. You will not be able to afford food. You will not be able to afford fuel. You will not be able to afford shoes for your children. Now, at the same time that, that's happening, you also have people here in the West, in the defense industry and in governments, to include the big guy who occupies that big white building in D.C., him and his family, are likely getting a cut from the money and the weapons being sent into Ukraine. I want to remind people that it was 1 or 2 Sitreps ago, I think it was this last Sitrep, the day 167 one, where you had the CBS documentary came out where they interviewed people on the ground. The people on the ground said that only 30% of the weapons sent by the West ever reached the front lines. That a lot of it disappears into a black hole. And they cited in that documentary, and I did do a link to it over on Patreon. You'd have to dig through all my postings to find it because it was over a month ago. They did cite in that documentary the postings that people in Russia have found on the darknet being posted by people in Ukraine selling brand new javelins and NLAWs and 50 caliber sniper rifles and machine guns and artillery and tanks and everything on the international arms market on the darknet, on the dark web. I've mentioned it. I've linked to some of those reports multiple times over the past few months over on Patreon, even before the CBS documentary came out and we found out that 70% of the stuff is disappearing once it crosses that border into Ukraine. Granted, a lot of it gets destroyed, but a very hefty chunk of it is ending up on the international arms market. And I seriously suspect a cut from the sales of those weapons by members of the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military. A percentage of that goes to politicians in NATO and in the European Union and in North America. I said from the very beginning, the very first Sitrep, hell, I said it in the video before Russia went in on that Rant and Random Thoughts video where I made fun of the whole situation. I pointed out and have said multiple times, the economic system of Ukraine is corruption. That has not ended just because the war is going on. And to give you a good backup on that, which I did not link to the article yet over on Patreon, I'll have to go back and find one. You had here a week and a half ago, announcement came out from Raytheon, a major defense contractor in the United States. They used to produce the Javelin for the US government. They don't anymore because they discontinued the line and sold the equipment. Raytheon announced that Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Zelensky, will be the keynote speaker at an upcoming conference of American defense contractor companies, the military-industrial complex, because he has become their number one customer, their number one salesman. Because of the performance of Western equipment, especially from the United States in Ukraine, countries in Europe that do not produce their own equipment anymore and haven't since World War II, haven't since the Cold War, they are now coming to American defense contractors and signing contracts for billions of dollars of brand new equipment for their militaries. Ukraine now is what Afghanistan was from 2001 up until 2021, a year ago, last August, up until when the Taliban took over. That is what Ukraine is now. It is a giant black hole for dumping equipment and money into for it to disappear. And something I want to mention is, remember when Afghanistan fell, there was this big stink about, oh, all the equipment left in Afghanistan. We left $83 billion or $87 billion worth of equipment. Gerald Celente over at Trends Journal, he has been tracking so far into this war. The United States alone has sent over $67 billion in weapons and munitions and equipment to Ukraine. That does not include the money that was loaned to the Ukrainian government. And God only knows where that went. $67 billion in equipment so far. And I know I have heard others who have been trying to keep track on this. They are saying that the true number for equipment alone that has gone into Ukraine is around 80 billion so far. And you know what? We are sending more all the time that you are not aware of. Every single week we send at least $1 billion in equipment. Only a small percentage of that is announced in the media and approved by Congress. The rest of it comes directly from the Pentagon stocks. This is considered military aid of no longer required equipment. This is where you have those units in the National Guard, in the reserves, and active duty that are being drawn down because they don't have the manpower for it, because they kicked so many out for being vax objectors to the recent hotshot. So what the military did, they consolidated units, took the equipment that was in that unit, boxed it up, put shipped to Ukraine labels on the side, and they sent it over. Every week we seem to be sending at least 4 more HIMARS launchers. I can't even keep track of how many of those we've sent. Because when we supposedly had sent only 16, you had the Pentagon state at that time that we had already delivered over 25. And that they were planning on at least 25 more. A common tactic that I have seen since this war started is you would see the announcement of a military aid package, either from the White House or the Pentagon, and it would be, say, $400 million. And then a day or two later, if even 24 hours later, you would see the other organization, either Pentagon or White House, one or the other, they would do an announcement of military aid going to Ukraine, but it would be a different number. But it would be close to that first number that was announced. Now, people are supposed to think, oh, we're sending less than what we announced a couple days ago. No, that second number is a second package. So we're sending $400 million of military equipment on Tuesday. Wednesday, you have the White House announcing we're sending $375 million. And then a couple days after that, we hear about, oh, Congress is approving an aid package, which includes another $200 million in military aid going to Ukraine. So we're sending over $1 billion worth of equipment in a single week. And I have noticed this week after week after week after week after week since this war started back in February. Now, after the last Sitrep, it was about a week or two after, someone in the Pentagon let it slip that U.S. stockpiles of munitions, especially our stockpiles of 155 millimeter artillery shells, Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger missiles, and anti-rockets, are dangerously low. We have gone below the minimum requirements we are required to have on hand in storage in case of a war. Now, I know there's pro-Ukraine people right now screaming at me while I'm saying this, saying that's impossible. We'll just make more. We'll buy more. Remember Raytheon? I just told you. They discontinued the Javelin. They stopped making them. They sold the equipment to make the Javelins. It will be a minimum of 2 years for them to even start the production lines. At least 2 years, and that's if they only focus on the Javelin production and purchasing the equipment and materials to produce them. 2 years. But members of Congress had said months ago, realistically, it will take a minimum of 3 years before Raytheon will produce even a single Javelin anti-tank missile for the U.S. military, let alone everyone else around the world that is signing contracts with Raytheon right now for Javelins. And then add to that Stinger missiles, which we haven't produced in almost 20 years. That production line was ended at the start of the global war on terrorism because Al-Qaeda didn't have an air force. So why should we be purchasing Stinger missiles? So we stopped. So they ended production. The company that was making them sold off the equipment. Why have it on hand, taking up space when they can work on something else? We are depleting the arsenal of democracy. When this country gets attacked, we will go to those bunkers. We will open those locks, cut them off the doors, fling the doors open, and we're just going to see empty pallets and pieces of paper in there because the bunkers are empty. The only way we can refill those bunkers is if we put in a massive increase in the budget. And if we do that massive increase in the budget, well, then those defense contractors will be rubbing their hands together because at that point, they're going to jack up the price on that ordinance, say that they can't go on the previous contracted price because of inflation or supply chain issues and whatever. So they'll double or triple the per unit cost to replace those munitions and those weapons, which we are sending to Ukraine still. And it came out from the Pentagon right after the last Sitrep. The Pentagon said they are planning for fighting in Ukraine through at least 2023, for at least another year and 4 months. Minimum. And we're not the only ones that have done that. A week ago here, the foreign minister of Germany said to the press that regardless of what voters in Germany told her to do, regardless of what the government would tell her to do, she was still going to send weapons and money to Ukraine. So fuck the people that put them in power. Fuck the people that they're supposed to be represented. Doesn't matter what you want. You're a serf, you're a commoner, you don't count. The new royalty that is in charge is making the decision that they need to take your money and send it to here. The war in Ukraine will never end. And I guarantee that even if, and it's a huge if, the Ukrainian armed forces actually gets close to pushing Russian troops out of Ukraine, NATO will do something to give Russia an advantage at that point to push back in to take more territory to justify a continuation of the war. What do I think that they would use? Well, guess what here? You had the foreign minister or the defense minister of Ukraine. It was someone in their Ministry of Defense, either their top general or their defense minister, stated here a week to 2 weeks ago. And I did link to this over on Patreon, that they believe that because of losses on the battlefield, Russia is going to hit the Ukrainians with a nuke or several nukes. Now, Russia stated after that came out, reiterating what they said multiple times since the war started, they will not use nuclear weapons of any type in Ukraine. That Russian policy right now is they will only use nuclear weapons if there is a war on their soil and they are looking at total defeat. Go to my Patreon, read the article. It's from Zero Hedge. It's in there. Near the end of the article, you have the exact quote from the Russian foreign minister, that they will not use nukes in Ukraine. But you still have in the media here in the West saying that it's only a matter of time before Russia uses nukes. The only ones who have a reason to use nukes would be us, to guarantee that that war continues on. So more money goes under the table into people's pockets, into people's offshore bank accounts. I asked my patrons over Patreon here last week. I put a question to them. Should I continue? I gave them a lot of this information, or at least some of it. And I asked them the question. I left it up to them. Should I continue doing sit reps? Or should I go back to really what this channel is the best at? And that's looking at the information that's coming out from the ground. Taking that information, breaking it down into something useful for patriots here and around the world that very soon will be having to defend their homelands. Every single patron that commented to that said, forget the sit reps, go back to what you do best. Take what you're seeing as going on in that battlefield and make it relevant for us. Explain how what is happening on the battlefield, why it's happening the way it is. What can we learn from it? And I did that a couple weeks ago here. I got tired of constantly reading stuff on Ukraine. I said, screw it. And talked with Combat Cameraman. We came up with the idea on the Russian mine laying techniques video. And then that led into the videos on hasty minefield doctrine. And that came about because of what we were seeing and reading was happening down here in Kherson at that time, after the offensive had officially been launched, but really has gone nowhere. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to that. I'm going to go back to what I have done since this channel started. I will read the articles. If I find something that's really, really pertinent, I'll still post it over at Patreon. But I will watch what's going on and see, hey, can we make a battle drill out of this? What lesson can we learn on this situation? And point it out. And there are a few videos I still have that are bouncing around in my head for ideas as to what's going on in Ukraine right now that I can potentially do. I just have to sit down, put the time into working on that instead of reading about Ukraine. Just taking another drink of alcohol. Now, what's actually happening right now? Maybe I'll do that here now as the final on the Sitrep. Down in the Kherson region, officially, the offensive was launched. And it hit a fucking brick wall. Only in one location did the Ukrainians make any appreciable advance. And basically it looks like a blister on the front lines when you look at a lot of the other maps. It's not very big, it's extremely small. It's what's referred to in military terminology as a salient. It's just this bulge in the front lines that very, very easily can be cut off by the Russians attacking from both sides, from the east and from the west, cutting them off. And then the Russians attacking to reestablish the front lines, leaving that Ukrainian force cut off behind the lines, and then using air defense and air support, cut them off from resupply. Then all those Ukrainian troops inside that salient are fucked. They either have to surrender or be annihilated or starve to death. The offensive down in Kherson has gone extremely badly. That's why they're not really talking about it much in the press, not for any much for details. About 2 to 3 weeks ago when the offensive started, they talked up on how the offensive was finally happening and they're going to retake Crimea. You know, it's just a matter of days. Well, after a couple days, there was no major advancements on the front line. Some attacks had occurred. There were a few penetrations. I've heard less than a dozen penetrations of any real depth beyond a couple hundred meters. And within a couple days of that, they were pushed back to their original trenches, where they've been sitting at since before that offensive began. Now, the media here in the West, and I noticed this was a tip-off to me, they told people that they've been psyching up for days about, oh, the Ukrainian offensive, they're going to retake Kherson, they're going to take the Crimea, you know, they're kicking out Russia. And I seen this same statement made on multiple networks. I seen it on Fox, on CNN, MSNBC, and others that I could stand watching reports from. They stated that, quote, the Ukrainians are advancing cautiously and securing the area before they make further advances. Now, for those of you that do not speak propaganda because you never served in the military, what that meant was they were stalemated and they were getting the shit kicked out of them. Now, at the same time that this was going on, over on social media out of Russia, in particular Intel Slava, which is one of the places I've gone for information from the Russian side. Granted, the information on that channel, a lot of it comes directly from the Russian government, so it's going to be slanted. But the Russian social media, there were a lot of postings about entire Ukrainian units being wiped out in a single day. Videos of the Russian troops walking through the battlefield as soon as it was secure, showing the Ukrainian bodies laying everywhere and pieces of bodies laying everywhere. They would cover the faces at least. And they would show the destroyed equipment from the West. They would show the destroyed HIMARS launchers. They would show the destroyed M777 155mm howitzers from the United States. They would show the destroyed M109 howitzers from Germany and Norway. You know, they would show the destroyed Polish T-72 tanks. They would show the destroyed East German BMP-1s. And yes, there's little details on all of that equipment that allows you to tell that, hey, this is a Polish version, not a Russian version. This is the East German version, not the Soviet version. If you look for those little details, that's one of the ways you can tell if that photo that's being shown is actual stuff from the West, or is this stuff that could potentially be Russian, that was destroyed, that the Russians are saying is Ukrainian. And then there's also the bodies. We know about the gold armbands, the blue armbands, and then you also see a lot of small Ukrainian patches sewn onto the shoulders and the backpacks and the body armor of the Ukrainian troops, and you see those on these Ukrainians laying on the ground in fresh pools of blood. That was a big indicator to me that, hey, they're losing bad down in Kherson. Now, in order to counter that, the Ukrainians then launched a second offensive, which was completely unexpected, up around Kharkov. Now, the offensive up in Kharkov has done better because the Russians had pulled a lot of units from up around here where it was kind of stable, shifted them to the west to down around Kherson. That's why you've seen a lot of DPR militia units over here and not over here where they should be. They were shifted over here to bolster this area to slow the expected Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainians have made some decent gains up around here, but nothing that I would say, hey, that's a really good job. Seriously. The media keeps playing up that, oh, they've captured 1,000 square kilometers of territory all across the front line. Well, that's really not a lot. Then all of a sudden that same day it was, oh, well, we misspoke. It wasn't 1,000, it's 3,000. 3,000 square kilometers. And then, well, that's really not a lot. Then it all of a sudden changed to 3,000 square miles. You know, they just keep upping the number, but you're not really seeing that much of an advance on the front lines. Now, you do see that Ukraine has took back a chunk in here. They've now cut off the supply route coming down through here from Novgorod, I believe it is. They did finally cut that road and rail. They did succeed in doing that, and then after they did that, they shifted south and retook Izium here within the last 48 hours. Do I think they're going to be able to hold it? No. Because already the Russians, they fell back to positions that they could better defend. They blunted a lot of the Ukrainian push going east. And the Russians, I believe, are getting ready to go back on the offensive to retake this territory. And when they do that, you can guarantee they're going to take more of a chunk in that fight, because the Ukrainians will have spent a hell of a lot of strength in this area. They're not going to have as much over here to back this up anymore in a defense, especially when the Russians bust through. How are the Russians going to bust through, security guy? Really simple. Traditional Russian tactics. Pound the shit out of them with artillery, with rockets, air support, and helicopter gunships. They can do it. I don't care how many HIMARS launchers Ukraine has in this area. The Russians have a hell of a lot more artillery, and they're a hell of a lot better at it. That's always been the Russian bread and butter, has been pound the hell out of your enemy with artillery and then walk over the top of them. That has been a tactic of theirs for hundreds of years. Now, Zelensky is talking tough about the Ukrainian military. They're going to be on the border any day now. The governor of Luhansk, People's Republic, and he was voted into office by the population of Luhansk. He states that the Ukrainians have no idea the hell waiting for them if they do get back up in here. Those of you that are not aware of it, this war did not start in February. It started in 2014 with the Maidan Revolution in Kiev. The Maidan Revolution was funded and quarterbacked by non-governmental organizations, with a lot of them having monetary ties with George Soros and some of the other, Dr. Evil types that have been behind the curtain for decades. And also by Western intelligence, NATO countries. In particular, the CIA and MI6 is what I've heard out of Britain. Now, they deposed in 2014. For those of you that aren't aware of this, there are documentaries on Ukraine made before the Russian invasion explaining all of this. And I've linked to them over on Patreon also over the past 6 months now. I've linked to at least 2 that I can remember right off the bat on just that alone, the lead up to the war of what was going on in Ukraine that was fomented by governments in the West and especially our intel services. But after the Russian-friendly, not necessarily pro-Russian, but Russian-friendly government in Ukraine was deposed in 2014, a puppet president was put in charge, and he mobilized the ethnic Ukrainians against the ethnic Russians. That's what started the Ukrainian Civil War in 2015, where you've seen the rise of groups like the Azov Battalion, like Right Sector, and all these other pro-Nazi, neo-Nazi, and Stefan Bandera supporting organizations. I've mentioned this before. Stefan Bandera was the fascist dictator that the Nazis put in charge of Ukraine when they occupied the country in the beginning of World War II. He is considered a national hero to Ukraine. And A lot of the ethnic cleansing stuff is considered a very good idea by a lot of ethnic Ukrainians. And for 8 years, they have led a war of extermination over here in the Donbass against the people of Donetsk and Luhansk. And what you're probably not aware of, if this is your first Sitrep, it's actually illegal in Ukraine for anyone to speak Russian in public. It is illegal in Ukraine for anyone to celebrate Russian culture or Russian holidays. It's against the law. You will be arrested. It was against the law before the war even began in February, or the invasion started in February. Just to add a little more to that, the government in Kiev, since the war started, has made it illegal for anyone in the occupied territories to accept humanitarian aid from Russians. Meaning you're running out of food. The only people you can get it from is humanitarian aid from Russian aid organizations. You take that food, the Ukrainian government in Kiev considers you a war criminal. Literally. And in Ukraine, war criminals are executed. No trial, no jury, you're just shot. And from what we're seeing on reports coming out from down here, and especially in this area where Russian forces have already started counterattacks over the last 48 hours, they're finding a lot of bodies. Bodies of people that are ethnic Russians who may not have even supported Russia in the war. They may have supported Ukraine. But just because of being Russian, they're being found laying in a ditch or laying on the side of the road with their head blown apart from a rifle shot at close range. Ukraine, over the last 24 hours here, is stating that, well, we're seeing indications of massive war crimes by Russian troops on the front lines as they're retreating. And they're calling for the United Nations come in to investigate this. Now, over that same time period, you had Russian units literally retaking areas and finding fresh corpses still cooling on the ground. The blood still flowing out, hasn't even coagulated yet. Meaning those executions had just happened by Ukrainian forces before the Russians got there. They were reporting that and showing the pictures on Russian social media. But you don't hear about that in Western press. All you hear about in Western press is about how the Russians are massacring Ukrainians. When, just like up here, that city up here, Baku or whatever the hell it was, north of Kiev, all the evidence is pointing to the Ukrainian units as they're fleeing the area. They're the ones doing it. And then they go on the international press and say, oh no, it's the Russians doing it. Where can you find this information? Look for it. It's out there. Don't just go to CNN. Don't just go to Fox News. Don't just go to Newsmax. Look at those reports from the independent journalists on the ground. Get into Russian social media, things like Intel Slava. Hell, maybe I'll post the link again on Patreon so people can go over there and look this stuff up themselves every day, because it's just a continuous report all day long. They're constantly posting new updates about what's going on front lines. The government of Ukraine needs to go, plain and simple. They're committing war crimes. Even if they're not the ones giving the orders to the units up here doing it, it's the laws that they have passed back here that has turned half the population, the ethnic Russian population, into Untermenschen, to be treated the same way their grandfathers did back in the 1940s. For those of you that have forgot, Ukraine had multiple units in the German SS. Entire divisions of Ukrainians served in the SS, served Hitler. And their descendants are committing the same atrocities over here and have been for 8 years. I don't have a horse in this fight. I don't. I don't support either government in this fight. But if I have to lean any direction or another, I lean to the people in here. The people of the Donbass that have been getting attacked for 8 years. Slaughtered just because of their ethnicity. Just because they speak a different language. Why the hell do you slaughter civilians just because of that? What the fuck does that accomplish? It accomplishes genocide. It accomplishes ethnic cleansing. No different than what happened in Rwanda. Or any of the other places we've heard about over the last 100 years. Where an occupying force came in and just started slaughtering the indigenous population just because of their language, their skin color, or their religion. This war needs to fucking end, and it needs to end now. The longer it keeps going on, the weaker the United States is going to be. And maybe that's the point. The politicians are lining their pockets with a percentage of everything that goes into Ukraine. And I'm not just talking to politicians here. I'm talking to politicians here in the West, here in the United States, here in a city over in Maryland that's federal territory. No one talks about that anymore. No one talks about the 10% going to the big guy. No one wants to talk about that. Do you think that's gone away? Maybe that would explain why he keeps wanting to send more equipment, more money all the time. Constantly more. Because maybe he is getting 10% of that. Still. That war is not going to end. A lot more people are going to die. America is going to be weakened. I've said this before to other people that the remake of Red Dawn becomes more and more plausible with every day. Not with North Korea invading the United States, but with China. The original script for that movie. We were supposed to be invaded by China in the West and Russia in the East. Well, I doubt it's going to be Russia in the East. Who knows who it'll be there now. But I'd say Chinese naval infantry coming across the shore in Long Beach, in San Diego, Los Angeles. Coming off the boats right into San Francisco. I'd say every day that becomes more and more plausible. And when it happens, we ain't going to have the equipment to push them off the beach. The military won't have the ammunition. They won't have the troops, especially troops that are competent, because they're spending more time now focusing on social justice issues and gender pronouns and all that garbage now instead of actual combat training. If you're serving in the military now, I want you to think, how long has it been since you've done a company level exercise focusing on your primary combat tasks? How long has it been since you've done a battalion level exercise or a brigade level exercise? How long has it been since you went to NTC or JRTC? How long has it been since your squad leader sat you down and taught you basics on how to stay alive in combat. And it doesn't matter if you're a cook, a truck driver, or a fucking typist in PAC. How long has it been since you've done anything other than sexual harassment training, transgender phobia training, gender pronoun usage training, social justice anti-whiteism training? How long? You're being set up to become cannon fodder. So that unfortunately people like me who've already served, who've already done our goddamn time in the fucking war zone, are going to have to pick up our weapons again, throw on what gear we have, and take your place. I'm going to end it there. As I said, this is the last Sitrep. Maybe I'll do something if there's a major battle, a major siege or something, a siege of Stalingrad situation or siege of Leningrad situation. Maybe I'll kick out a few Sitreps on. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Russia will retake all the area that Ukraine is celebrating they've recaptured now. They're going to lose it over the coming weeks. And they're going to suffer tremendous casualties, which they cannot afford to. The front lines of the Ukrainian military is being filled by old people and kids now. People who've only gotten a couple weeks of combat training at most. The veterans are dead. The Ukrainian army that was on the borders in February is gone. They suffered over 80% casualties. And that's reports from Ukrainian medics and Ukrainian commanders that have talked to the media about it. We'll probably be seeing Ukraine here on America's soil in not too long. But it won't be Russians that are invading. It'll be the People's Liberation Army. For all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, for everyone in this country, always remember Essayons. Let us try.